In this episode, we talk about an issue that can impact the future of the Indian pharmaceutical industry. We also talk about the Enforcement Directorate's efforts towards completing investigations and speeding up trials under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. But we begin today by talking about a new definition of the Aravalli Hills proposed by a committee under the Environment Secretary and approved by the Supreme Court. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Earlier this week, protests broke out in several parts of Rajasthan, including Jodhpur, Udaipur and Sikar, over a new uniform definition of the Aravalli Hills, which critics say could leave more than 90% of the range vulnerable to mining and construction. This new definition was proposed by a committee under the Environment Secretary and was approved by the Supreme Court on the 20th of November. Now, the Aravalli range stretches from Delhi in the north to Gujarat in the south, passing through Haryana and Rajasthan, with Rajasthan accounting for nearly 2/3 of the range. Despite its ecological importance, for decades, these hills have been under severe pressure from both legal and illegal mining, as well as other development activities such as construction. Now, even as criticism and protests continue, the Environment Minister has maintained that the new definition does not relax mining restrictions in the range, saying mining would be permissible in only 0.19% of the Aravallis. So what exactly is this new definition, and how exactly would it affect the Aravalli range? To find this out, my colleague Shashank speaks to the Indian Express's Jay Mazoomdar.
Jay, before we talk about this new definition and how it will impact the Aravallis, I wanted to ask you something basic, which is that what makes this range so crucial for this region? Why is it so important?
Yeah, first thing is that it is an ancient landform, so it's there for ages. It hosts a very wide array of biodiversity. Many species which are found here are endemic, unique to this area. And there are a number of national parks, tiger reserves, sanctuaries, wetland areas in this stretch. And it also acts as a natural barrier which stops from the eastward movement of the dust and sand from the western desert areas, and which is very crucial for the land east of Aravalli to stay green. If you look at a natural map of India, you will see clearly that along the line of the Aravalli, which runs north to south, to the west of this line, you will see the contour is in brown, and on the east it's green. So it's very critical for the human health also, given the pollution that we are going through right now.
Right. One of the things that people have been pointing out is that the Aravalli range actually prevents a lot of pollutants from entering the capital.
Yeah, I mean, that is obviously one key function of this hill range. And even hills which are as low as 20 meters in height, even they perform a critical function in blocking as windbreakers, and PM 2.5 may travel higher in the air, but PM 10 in particular, they travel lower to the ground. And this hill range in that sense has been a very effective barrier to such dust particle movement and sand particle movement eastward.
And Jen, now let's talk about this new definition, because the fear is that it will put the majority of the range under threat. So could you break down this definition for us, especially considering that some of it can seem a bit technical? Now, it says that under the new definition, any landform that is at an elevation of 100 meters or more above the local relief will be considered as part of Aravalli Hills, along with its slopes and adjacent land. So what does local relief mean in this context?
So if you have traveled in the hills of, say, Himachal or Uttarakhand, you have seen that sometimes when you build a house on the slope, so from one side you enter the house, your entrance is from the road in the third floor. On the other side of the road, which is on the other side of the house, which runs down the slope, your entrance would be probably from the ground floor 30 feet below. So it all depends on your reference point. So if you're measuring such a building, if you measure the building from the upper road, you will measure only one floor because that one floor is above the upper road. But if you measure the same building from the lower road, then you would get 3 floors. So it all actually boils down to your reference point from where you will be measuring the height.
Okay, so in this example, if I'm trying to measure the elevation of this building, it will change based on which side I'm measuring it from, right? But if I truly wanted to know the elevation of the building, shouldn't I be looking at the area's lowest elevation point? Shouldn't that be the baseline?
Yeah, you have to find one standard baseline for this measurement to be objective and uniform. So when FSI realized that this 100-meter elevation formula was being pushed through, then they recommended that at least this standard baseline should be defined as the lowest elevation of a state above sea level. So in case of Rajasthan, that is 115 meters ASL. So they said that if you take that as a benchmark and then you can measure all hills, the peaks at XY ASL, and then you know that what is above 100 meters or not. But if you go from the local elevation, that is the land area, basically the dip between two hills. So that dip itself could be at elevation of 200 meters. And on that, the hill would be some 50 meters. So the hill is actually 250 meters, but you are measuring only 50. And that hill would be excluded from under the new definition of Aravalli.
And could you talk about how this new definition came about and how the Aravalli range was defined earlier?
Yeah, so there was no definition of Aravalli the way we are seeking now, because for centuries and even in the recent times, Aravalli has been defined as it is. So there was never a need really to define Aravalli. It's a hill range and it's visible where it is not rising too high. Even there, you can tell that you are on the rocks. So in that sense, it was never felt necessary. And the four states where this range spans, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Haryana, and Delhi, out of these four states, only Rajasthan ever had any yardstick. And that too was from the perspective of mining. They used to allow mining leases in areas under 100-meter elevation. So that was going on for more than 20 years. And in 2010, when this was presented before the Supreme Court, the court felt that there should be an uniform benchmark for Aravalli in all four states. And then it asked the Supreme Court Empowered Committee, which in turn engaged the Forest Survey of India for the job. And the Forest Survey of India, they bought the Survey of India topo sheets. And from there, they did a detailed survey in 15 districts of Rajasthan, which is the key Aravalli zone because bulk of the range is in Rajasthan. And in those 15 districts, they found that if they go by 3-degree slope or higher, then that part shows the characteristics of Aravalli and those areas should be identified as Aravalli. So going by that benchmark, they identified roughly 40,000 square kilometers in these 15 districts of Rajasthan as Aravalli.
So this 3 degrees benchmark, this is what the Forest Survey of India identified.
Yeah, 3 degrees or more. That benchmark was proposed, and then the purpose was to identify the Aravalli range in these 15 districts. And then on that, they wanted to superimpose the ongoing mining leases to find out how much is legal and what is not legal. That process was never really completed because the state of Rajasthan, they were quite reluctant over the years to hand over the mining coordinates. So the mining coordinates they came in installments. So eventually in 2018, the court observed that from the data available, it was clear that a lot of mining is going on illegally and in areas where it should not be allowed. Then again, this came up last year when the Supreme Court thought that there should be a common benchmark for 4 states. So again, FSI came in the picture. They stood by their 3 degrees or more slope formula. But for some reason, the ministry consulted the 4 states and then they decided that the old benchmark of 100 meters, which was already being used by Rajasthan for mining and which was not accepted by the Supreme Court in 2010, that benchmark would be appropriate.
And now based on this new definition where we're looking at 100 meters of elevation based on the local relief, how much of the Aravallis would not be counted as part of the range?
So simple answer is we don't know yet. What FSI told the ministry that of all the hills, some 1,17,000-18,000 hills that they found in these 15 districts, Aravalli hills, of only about 1,000 of those are above 100 meters. So 99% of the hills will be excluded. But that doesn't necessarily mean that 99% of the Aravalli area would be excluded because different hills span differently. The bigger hills will have larger areas. One can safely assume that at least 80-85% areas would be excluded if this new formula is applied, compared to if you apply the 3-degree slope formula.
And Jay, one of the big concerns, of course, is mining. But are there any other concerns beside it that are worrisome?
Yeah, this figure of 0.19% of Aravalli areas would be under mining. This is again very misleading because this 0.19% of the entire area of 34 Aravalli districts, which comes to some 1.4, 1.5 lakh square kilometer. So this is about 280 square kilometers. So that is the total area currently under mining leases. So this is the area where mining is already taking place. It has nothing to do with what will happen in future once Aravalli is redefined under the new definition. This has nothing to do with that question. So the point is that this 280 square kilometers is where already mining is happening, and this is in Aravalli. So when Aravalli is redefined and a large area is excluded, how much of those excluded areas will go under mining or other forms of development? That question the ministry hasn't addressed at all. And nobody in their real sense would go for mining in Aravalli, in Delhi NCR, in Gurgaon, because it's a lot more lucrative to develop housing estates there. So at one hand, the future scope of mining is not addressed by the ministry. And on the other hand, by harping on about mining alone, they are not addressing this possibility of opening up Aravalli areas for other forms of development. We all know the pressure these Gair-Mumkin Pahars are in Gurgaon or Faridabad. And they're all prime real estate. I mean, if under the new definition, they are not identified as Aravalli anymore, then nothing stops anyone from developing those areas.
And it's interesting that FSI itself has been flagging some of these concerns to the ministry. Do we know how the ministry responded to its concerns?
The affidavit that they submitted to the Supreme Court that doesn't really justify this new definition other than citing some arguments which are faulty, to put it mildly, because they said that the average slope of some 10-12 districts in Aravalli zone is under 3 degrees. So they claimed that if you apply FSI slope formula, then those districts would be excluded. This very conveniently ignored the fact that if you take the entire districts, much of which is plains, then the average would obviously be much lower, and the slope rises only where the hills are. So using that logic that the average slope of a district is below 3 degrees, they tried to push it through, and for some reason they succeeded. And they also claimed before the Supreme Court that this new definition will cover more areas, will identify more areas as Aravalli compared to FSI's 3% slope formula. However, when the ministry held a press conference yesterday and this question was put to them that if they can quantify how much area would be covered as Aravalli under the new definition, then the answer was, we can't tell. When we do the ground demarcation district by district, we will get to know. So it's inexplicable without having any knowledge of how much this new definition would cover. They gave the court that assurance that it will cover more than FSI's formula.
And Jay, you also write that large tracts which were earlier identified as part of the range have now been left out. Could you give some examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are very famous stretches of Aravalli, which we all know. For example, the Chittor Fort, it's a UNESCO site, it's Aravalli, so the district is altogether missing in the list. Sawai Madhopur, where the Ranthambore Fort is also on Aravalli, it's at the junction of the Vindhya range and the Aravalli range, so that district is altogether gone. In Nagaur also, FSI measured some 1,000 square kilometer under Aravalli, that district is also missing. So if you go to the extreme, then some government documents, I think they identify more than 50 districts under Aravalli, and now we have only 34. In the list that the ministry gave to the Supreme Court.
And now that the ministry has been facing this pushback, do we know how they will be proceeding forward with this?
One can't really tell because in the last 2-3 days, what they have averred again and again is that Aravalli is not under threat, everything will be protected, nothing will be open to development or mining. But if it is so, then if every corner of the range is under protection, then what is the need for this new definition and what is the scope for this sustainable mining plan that will be now chalked up across the range? So these two realities, they're contradictory. I mean, if you are not planning to open up new areas to mines and development, then this exercise is unnecessary. And also, technically speaking, if the ministry or the government says that Aravalli areas will be protected, they may be telling you that the new Aravalli areas under the new definition will be protected. We haven't heard anything clearly about the areas which are likely to be excluded under the new definition.
And next, we talk about an issue that could impact the future of India's pharmaceutical industry. In the recent weeks, Indian government officials have been holding multiple meetings with the pharmaceutical industry stakeholders. These meetings have been about how the government can implement something called data exclusivity in the pharmaceutical drugs sector.
So, data exclusivity, in addition to patents, protects the interest of an innovator company.
That's the Indian Express's Anonna Dutt, who reports on health for the paper.
Essentially, the data that a company submits to a drug regulator, on safety, efficacy, effectiveness of a medicine, they say that under data exclusivity, they hold the exclusive rights to it, which means that the regulator cannot use this data to sort of approve other generic products during this window period. Essentially, what happens is the first company does a complete set of trials to get their product approved. But when a subsequent generic version of the drug wants to enter the market, they can conduct a smaller trial, which is known as a bioequivalence trial, which essentially demonstrates that their drug works in the same way as the innovator product within the body. And based on that, they can get an approval. And what the generic companies do is they have everything in place for when the patent expires and they can launch their products immediately. But if there is a data exclusivity in place, then the regulator would not be able to approve their products before this data exclusivity period runs out.
So this means even if the patent of a drug expires, the regulator would not be able to approve a generic drug if the data exclusivity is in place.
Or the companies would not be able to get an approval ahead, in preparation for patent expiry if there is a data exclusivity in place.
So data exclusivity essentially delays the entry of cheaper generic drugs into the market, an area where India has a significant advantage over many other countries. Now, interestingly, data exclusivity was also discussed during the negotiations with the UK and the European Free Trade Association. Back then, India had rejected the idea.
So, see, data exclusivity has been a topic which has been discussed in the past when there are international trade deals, because all the developed countries which are sort of the originators of the drugs do not want, the generic versions to come in so easily. So there have been previously also demands from the Indian government to put in place these, protective measures, but it hasn't happened so far. This is one of the first times that India is actually considering this, seeing that there have been meetings that have happened between the Commerce Ministry and the industry, as well as, stakeholders like the Health Ministry and the Pharma Department. So all of these meetings have happened last month. And what I've heard from people who were present in some of these meetings is that there is a push towards, implementing data exclusivity. And the question that was raised in the meeting was not whether it should be done or not, but how it can be done. So, of course, these are very initial stages and we still don't know whether it would actually happen, whether the government will actually push for it. But certainly there has been a serious consideration about it.
But Anonna, why does the Indian government want to bring in data exclusivity for drugs? And why did it change its mind after rejecting the idea during the trade negotiations with UK and EFTA?
So, yes, you're absolutely correct. India did reject data exclusivity, especially when the EFTA deal happened. And actually, for the EFTA, there was this demand raised at the time. And the deal does say that, in 1 year, there should be some sort of discussion on the provisions of data exclusivity. But from what I hear, it's mainly about bringing in more foreign direct investment into India. So as part of the EFTA negotiations, there is a hope that more money would come into India as FDI if these protectionist measures are taken. However, so far, India has been against implementing data exclusivity, especially when it comes to its pharma industry, because, more than 90% of the industry sustains on, making cheaper generic versions of new drugs. And if such measures are brought in, India might lose its edge in the global market. And at the moment, India is recognized as one of the biggest suppliers of these generic drugs, which could be hampered with these sort of measures.
And can you tell us how data exclusivity works in combination with patents and how the two can affect a drug's availability in the market?
So there are a couple of complications here. Data exclusivity and patent period is not the same. Data exclusivity is granted at the time when a drug enters the market. Now, what happens with patents? Patents usually cover a period of about 20 years, whereas data exclusivity is usually for a maximum period of, say, 10 years. Now, if this data exclusivity period comes within the patent period, not so much of a problem. So for example, if a drug which, enters the market in the 5th year of its patent, the data exclusivity period would be within the patent period, and that is fine. But if, say, a drug enters the market in the 17th year of its 20-year patent period, then the data exclusivity period actually goes beyond the patent period, during which time the generic drug companies will not be able to come into the market simply because they cannot get approvals based on the data from the originator company. They can enter the market if they conduct all the trial from scratch. The second is, like I mentioned previously, a lot of these companies would in India actually get ready for a patent expiry. So, for example, if a patent is expiring in, say, 2 years, they would start conducting their bioequivalence trials before. And they would have all this data to be presented to the regulator. And usually they get these approvals as well before the patent period is over so that they can enter the market right as the patent expires.
Right. And Anonna, we also understand that data exclusivity then also hampers the ability to challenge a patent, right?
Yes. So when companies are able to get this approval before a patent period, they can then reach out to the courts and challenge the patent, saying that, we can make it more accessible, we can make it for a cheaper. So there are certain provisions in which case patents can be challenged. So for example, if a company has a patent on a drug and does not bring it to India at all, or if the drug is exorbitantly priced, if the access is very little. So there are several different provisions under which the patent can be challenged. And I mean, in the 20 years that we've had pharmaceutical patents, it hasn't happened too many times, but there was, I think, once in 2012 that a patent was successfully challenged and granted to a company other than the originator. And it has happened recently where the court has actually allowed a generic manufacturer to continue manufacturing its product, even though the company states that its patent hasn't expired because of certain technicalities, and also the cost was very high for this product, which was meant for rare diseases. So that sort of challenge cannot happen if there is, say, data exclusivity, because then the companies would not have the resource to do such huge trials, especially, say, in case of rare diseases where it is more time consuming because there are very few patients living with that kind of condition.
And India's apex drug regulator, the CDSCO, issued a notice recently before these meetings began. What was that about?
So yes, that's what activists working in the field of drug access say. There was a notification from CDSCO in October where they have talked about, consulting with stakeholders to have discussions to ensure a level playing field. That is what they are saying. So what the notice goes on to say is that, a lot of companies, the first company, whether it's the innovator company or whether it's the company that brings in a drug to the country for the first time, they actually end up doing rigorous trials, and then The others just immediately submit a bioequivalence trial study and they get approvals. So the notice said that the subsequent applicants who obtain approval for the same new drug based on bioequivalence data do not have as much burden of cost and regulatory compliance as the first person to do it. So there should be some sort of level playing field for the first person to bring in the drug to India. Now, this notification does not talk about any method to implement it or what would be the incentive for the person to bring in the drug first to India. This was just sort of meant to be a discussion with stakeholders. But there were activists who have written to the health ministry saying that this is not transparent and this could actually lead to evergreening of patents, which means that, companies could keep extending their patent period. It could delay the entry of cheaper generic drugs into the market. And it could also lead to companies just unnecessarily doing clinical trials on supposed new drugs or even newer combinations of drugs just to get these incentives. So these were some of the concerns that were raised by activists in the field of medicine access.
And Anonna, which category of drugs are likely to be affected if data exclusivity is implemented?
So, this would mainly affect newer molecules, which may be very much in demand. So, for example, it could be semaglutide, whose patent is supposed to expire in 2026. Or, there are these new drugs meant for Alzheimer's, new drugs for cancers, which are still under patent and are very expensive in India. And if data exclusivity provisions are brought in, these drugs might make harder for generic companies to bring in their version of these newer drugs.
And in the end, we talk about the Enforcement Directorate, which, after facing sustained criticism over the slow pace of its cases, is now shifting its focus towards completing investigations and speeding up trials under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Over the past 2 decades, only a little over 50 money laundering cases have reached the end of trial, even as thousands of cases have been registered. Against this backdrop, the agency's leadership has asked the officials to prioritize finishing investigations and filing prosecution complaints instead of merely opening fresh cases. Sources have told the Indian Express's Deeptiman Tiwari that Enforcement Directorate Director Rahul Naveen has instructed officers to strike a better balance in their work. Officials have been asked not to concentrate exclusively on politically sensitive cases, but to also focus on emerging contemporary crimes, including cyber fraud, cryptocurrency-related offences, and terror financing. At the same time, the agency is engaging with the judiciary to increase the number of special courts dedicated to handling money laundering cases, with the aim of clearing the growing backlog of trials. Deeptiman writes that delays in investigations and trials have long been cited as one of the ED's major shortcomings. Since the money laundering law came into force in 2005, the agency has registered more than 8,000 cases, attached assets worth nearly rupees 1.9 lakh crore, and arrested over 1,000 individuals. However, investigations have been completed and prosecution complaints filed in fewer than 1/4 of these cases. He points out that the situation is even more stark when it comes to trials. So far, trials have been concluded in just 56 cases. While most of these resulted in convictions, charges have been framed in fewer than 400 cases overall. Sources within the agency point out that ED's conviction rate stands at around 95%, which they say compares favorably with other central agencies. However, they also acknowledge that prolonged investigations and pending trials undermine the justice process, is inconvenient for both the agency and the accused, and have contributed to public criticism. Officials say that while trials are ultimately decided by the courts, the agency can act faster at its own end. This has led to clear directions for quicker investigations, timely filling of prosecution complaints, and more consistent follow-up in court proceedings. Alongside this, the agency is also sharpening its focus on recovering assets and returning them to banks and other victims. So far, assets worth rupees 36,000 crore have been recovered, with a recovery target of rupees 15,000 crore set for the next financial year. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Niharika, Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.